The knock came so hard that the glass in the shop door shook. Marin Whitfield almost dropped the bucket of water she was carrying. It was 9 at night. The shop had been closed for an hour. No one knocked like that unless something was wrong. She set the bucket down and wiped her hands on her apron. Her heart was already racing before she reached the door. She thought of her daughter first, the way every parent does when a strange sound arrives too late in the evening. She thought of accidents, hospitals, bad news traveling fast. She opened the door only a few inches, keeping the chain locked. A man stood on the step. He was tall, his coat too clean and too fine for this narrow street of bakeries and shuttered shops. His hair was damp from the rain that had just started to fall. In his hand, held so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, was a small torn photograph. "I am sorry to disturb you at this hour," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. "I need to ask you something. It is about a woman named Eleanor Whitfield." Marin felt the air leave her chest. Eleanor Whitfield was her grandmother. She had been dead for 30 years. "Who are you?" Marin said, not a question, a demand. "My name is Julian Ashworth," he said. "I know this sounds strange. I am the Duke of Ravensmere." For a moment, Marin almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of thing that did not happen to women like her. Not in this town. Not to a woman who spent her days trimming stems and sweeping petals off the floor. "I do not know any dukes," she said, "and I would like you to leave." She began to close the door. He did not push against it, but he spoke quickly, before the gap could shut completely. "Please, just 5 minutes. I found this photograph in my grandfather's desk. It has your grandmother's name written on the back. There is something connected to her, something that was never finished. I have been trying to find her family for 3 days. Marin stopped. Her hand was still on the door, but she did not close it. 3 days, she repeated. "I drove through 4 counties, he said. "I have knocked on more doors than I can count. Yours is the first one that had the right name on the mailbox." There was something in the way he said it, tired, almost embarrassed, not the voice of a man playing a trick. Marin looked at the photograph in his hand. She could not see it clearly in the dim porch light, but she saw enough. A young woman with dark hair, standing in front of a garden gate, laughing at something outside the frame. Her grandmother had laughed like that. Marin remembered it from being very small, before the arthritis had taken the sound out of her grandmother's voice, before age had folded her into a smaller and quieter version of herself. "Give it to me," Marin said. He passed it through the gap in the door. She unhooked the chain without meaning to, and stepped back to let the porch light fall properly on the photograph. It was her. It was Eleanor, young, maybe 20, standing at a gate Marin did not recognize. On the back in faded ink was written, "Eleanor, summer, the year before everything changed." "Where did you get this?" Marin asked. "My grandfather's study, in a drawer that had not been opened since he died. There is a letter with it. I did not bring the letter tonight. I did not want to overwhelm you." "You are overwhelming me right now," Marin said. He almost smiled at that. It surprised her how much she noticed it. "I understand if you want me to leave," he said. "I only ask that you keep the photograph. It belongs to your family more than mine." Marin looked at him for a long moment. Rain was falling harder now, running down the collar of his expensive coat, and he did not seem to notice or care. "You are standing in the rain," she said. "I am aware. Why does that not bother you?" "Because I have spent 3 days chasing something that felt impossible to find," he said. "And I found it. The rain feels like a small price." Marin should have closed the door then. That would have been the sensible thing. Instead, she found herself studying his face, the exhaustion under his eyes, the sincerity that did not match the polished coat or the title he had given himself so plainly, as if it were simply a fact and not something to boast about. "I need to think about this," she said. "Come back tomorrow, during the day, when the shop is open and there are people around. Of course, he said. Thank you for not shutting the door on me completely. I might still, Marin said, tomorrow. He nodded, took a step back into the rain, and turned to leave. Marin shut the door and locked it, then stood there with the photograph in her hand, staring at her grandmother's young, laughing face. She did not sleep well that night. She kept the photograph on her nightstand, propped against the lamp, and every time she woke she looked at it again, as if it might have changed, as if it might explain itself. By morning she had almost convinced herself the whole thing was some elaborate mistake, or worse, some scheme. She had heard about people finding old family names and using them to get close to strangers for money. She resolved to be careful. She resolved to ask hard questions. The shop opened at 8. By 9, the morning rush of coffee and pastries from the bakery next door had crossed over into her small shop, people stopping to smell the fresh delivery of white roses she had arranged in the window. Marin worked with her hands, if not her full mind, trimming stems, filling water, greeting a regular customer named Grace Bennett who ran the bookshop 2 doors down. "You look tired," Grace said, leaning on the counter. "I did not sleep well." "Anything you want to tell me?" Marin almost told her everything. Grace was the closest thing she had to family in this town since her daughter had moved to London for work, but something made her hold back. It felt too strange to say out loud. A duke, her grandmother, a torn photograph. "Just a headache," Marin said instead. "Nothing serious." Grace did not push. She bought a small bunch of lavender and left with a wave, and Marin went back to her work, glancing at the door every time the little bell above it rang. He came at noon. Julian Ashworth walked into the shop wearing a plain gray coat this time, less obviously expensive, as if he had thought about how he would be received and dressed accordingly. He held a leather folder under one arm. "I brought the letter," he said, "and a few other things if you still want to hear them." Marin looked around the shop. 2 customers were browsing near the back, examining a stand of tulips. She did not want this conversation overheard. "Wait until they leave," she said quietly. He nodded and waited by the door, patient, looking at the flowers rather than at her, which she appreciated more than she expected to. When the customers finally left with their tulips, Marin turned the sign on the door to closed, even though it was the middle of the day. Even though closing meant losing sales she could not really afford to lose. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the small table she used for wrapping bouquets. "Tell me everything, and do not leave anything out." Julian sat across from her and opened the folder. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed and brittle, folded into thirds the way letters used to be before envelopes became thin and disposable. "This was written by my grandfather," he said. "Edmund Ashworth, the 9th Duke of Ravensmere. He wrote it and never sent it. I do not know why. My family found it after he died, but no one understood who Eleanor was. My father assumed it was an old friend. He put it away and forgot about it. I only found it myself 2 weeks ago while going through the estate records." "What does it say?" "It says he loved her, that he was engaged to marry her, before his family stopped it because she did not come from money or status. It says he regretted it every day of his life. It mentions a piece of property, a small cottage that belonged to Eleanor's family that he tried to protect for her after the engagement ended, using his own money quietly so her family would not lose their home." Marin stared at the letter without touching it. Her grandmother had never mentioned any of this. Not once. Not in all the years Marin had spent as a child in Eleanor's kitchen, learning to bake bread, learning to arrange flowers in jam jars because they could not afford real vases. "My grandmother never spoke about a duke," Marin said. "She never spoke about being engaged to anyone before my grandfather." "I imagine it was not something people discussed easily, given what happened," Julian said. "A broken engagement, especially one crossing that kind of social divide, would have caused a great deal of talk. Perhaps she wanted to leave it behind entirely. Marin finally reached out and touched the letter, careful not to press too hard on the fragile paper. "Why does this matter now?" she asked. "He is gone, she is gone. What is left to talk about?" "There is a matter of the cottage," Julian said. "It still exists. It has been sitting empty, technically part of the Ravensmere estate holdings, but my grandfather's letter makes it clear he never intended to keep it. He meant it for Alina and her family. My solicitor believes there may be a legal claim, something that should rightfully pass to her descendants. To you." Marin sat back in her chair, the weight of the words taking a moment to settle. "You are telling me I might own a cottage I have never seen?" "Possibly. There are legal steps involved, but that is not the only reason I came looking for you." "Then what is the other reason?" Julian paused, looking down at the letter rather than at her. "My grandfather spent his whole life in a marriage that people considered proper and suitable. He was miserable in it. He wrote about Alina until the end of his days, according to some of his other papers. I think, in some strange way, I wanted to meet the family of the woman who made him feel something real, even if only once. I wanted to see what kind of person she must have raised, to understand her better." The shop was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator that kept the flowers fresh. Marin did not know what to say to that. It was too honest, too sudden, for a man she had met less than a day earlier. "I am not her," Marin said finally. "Whatever you are looking for, I might not have it." "I did not expect to find anything specific," Julian said. "I only expected to find her name on a door somewhere and hand over an old photograph. I did not expect the shop to smell like her garden." "What do you mean?" "There is a description in the letter," he said, turning the page toward her. "He wrote about the flowers she grew, lavender near the gate, white roses along the fence. It is oddly similar to what you have in your window." Marin looked toward her own window display, the roses she had trimmed that morning, the lavender bundle she always kept near the door because customers liked the smell when they walked in. It was a coincidence, surely. Flowers were popular. Lavender and roses were common enough. But it unsettled her all the same. "I need time," she said. "This is a great deal to accept in one afternoon." "Of course." Julian closed the folder but left the photograph and a copy of the letter on the table for her. "Keep these. I am staying at the inn on the high street for the rest of the week. There is no pressure. I only wanted you to know the truth, whatever you decide to do with it." He stood, thanked her for her time, and left the shop quietly, the bell above the door ringing once behind him. Marin sat alone at the small table for a long while, the letter in front of her, the photograph beside it. She thought about her grandmother's hands, always busy, always moving, and wondered what those hands might have felt writing back to a man she was never allowed to marry, if she ever wrote back at all. She thought about the life Alina had built instead, the small house, the modest garden, the marriage to a man who worked with wood and never once, as far as Marin knew, made her cry from anything but happiness. It was a good life, a full one, but now Marin wondered if some part of her grandmother had spent decades quietly missing something else, something she never spoke of, something buried the way old letters get buried in drawers no one opens. She picked up the photograph again and studied the laughing young woman at the garden gate. "What were you not telling us?" Marin whispered to the picture, though she knew it could give her no answer. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the street had gone back to its ordinary rhythm. Cars passing, people walking with bags of groceries, life continuing exactly as it always did. But inside the small flower shop, something had shifted, quietly and completely, the way a single-drop stone changes the surface of still water, spreading outward long after the moment it fell. Marin did not know yet how far the ripples would travel. She only knew that for the first time in a very long while, she was afraid to close the shop for the night, afraid of what quiet and stillness might bring her mind to dwell on. She locked the door carefully, turned the sign, and carried the letter and photograph home with her, cradled against her chest like something fragile that might break if she was not careful enough. That night she read the letter 3 more times. Each time she noticed something new, a line about the color of Aline's eyes, a mention of a promise Edmund Ashworth said he never kept, though he did not explain what the promise had been. A closing line that read simply, "I am sorry," though the letter never said for what exactly. Maren fell asleep with the lamp still on, the letter resting on her chest, and dreamed of a garden she had never seen, filled with roses and lavender, and a young woman laughing at a gate that led somewhere she could not quite make out. When she woke, the sun was already high, and she realized with a small and unfamiliar flutter in her chest that she was thinking about Julian Ashworth's voice, calm and tired and honest, and wondering what he might say next. She told herself it did not mean anything. She told herself that twice, which was usually a sign that it meant something after all. 3 days passed before Maren allowed herself to walk to the inn on the high street. She told herself it was only to return the letter, that she had read it enough times and did not need to keep it any longer. She told herself several things on that short walk, and believed almost none of them. Julian was sitting near the window of the inn's small dining room when she arrived, a cup of tea in front of him that looked untouched. He stood as soon as he saw her, the way men in old films stood for women they respected, and Maren felt a strange discomfort at being treated with that kind of formality. "You did not have to come here," he said. "I would have returned to the shop." "I wanted to see where you were staying," Maren said. "It seemed only fair since you knew where I live and work." He smiled at that, a small, tired smile. "Fair enough, please sit." She sat across from him, placing the letter and photograph on the table between them. For a moment neither spoke. The waitress came and went, bringing Maren a cup of tea she had not asked for but did not refuse. "I spoke to my solicitor," Julian said finally. "A man named Charles Whitmore. He has handled our family's affairs for many years. He believes the claim on the cottage is legitimate, assuming we can establish that you are indeed Aline's descendant. There would need to be some paperwork, birth records, perhaps a visit to the county archive." "You make it sound simple." "It is not simple, but it is possible, and I would like to help you through it if you will allow me." Maren wrapped both hands around her teacup, more for something to hold than for warmth. "Why would you want to help me get a piece of property that belongs to your own family's estate?" "Because it was never truly ours," Julian said. "My grandfather made that clear enough in his letter. He held onto it out of guilt, not right. I do not want to inherit his guilt along with everything else." There was a long pause. Maren studied him, the calm way he held himself, the careful way he chose each word as if speaking too quickly might cause something to break. "Tell me about your family," she said. "The real story, not the one written on paper generations ago." Julian set down his own cup. "My father passed 2 years ago. My mother lives mostly at the family estate, though we do not speak often. I have one sister, Charlotte, who lives in Edinburgh and wants nothing to do with the title or the responsibilities that come with it. That leaves me. I inherited a house with more rooms than I know what to do with, and a great deal of expectation that comes attached to the name Ravensmere." "That sounds lonely," Maren said before she could stop herself. Julian looked at her for a moment, surprised. "It is, though I do not often admit that to anyone." "Why admit it to me?" "Because you seem like someone who would notice if I lied about it." Maren almost laughed. It was such an odd thing to say, and yet it landed somewhere true. They spent the next hour going through details neither of them had planned to share. Julian explained the estate, the tenants who depended on it, the constant pressure from distant relatives who believed he should marry someone with the right kind of family name to secure the future of Ravensmere. Maren found herself talking about her own life in turn, about her divorce 11 years earlier, about her daughter Alice living in London, working long hours at a design firm, and calling twice a week out of what Marin suspected was more guilt than genuine desire to talk. "Your husband," Julian said carefully, "if you do not mind me asking." "Ex-husband," Marin corrected. "Peter Dawson. We were married for 14 years. It did not end badly, not in the way people think of endings. It simply ended. We wanted different things, and neither of us was willing to pretend otherwise any longer." That sounds difficult in its own way, an ending without a villain. "Sometimes those are the hardest kind," Marin admitted. "There is no one to blame, only two people who grew into different shapes." They agreed, before the afternoon ended, that Marin would visit the county archive the following week, and that Julian would accompany her, given his familiarity with the legal process and his solicitor's connections there. It made sense, practically speaking. Marin told herself that was the only reason she agreed. The archive visit came on a gray Tuesday. The building smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of smell that made Marin sneeze twice before she had even reached the records desk. Julian handled the conversation with the archivist, a thin, careful man who seemed both impressed and slightly nervous at having a duke standing in his small reading room. They spent hours going through birth certificates, marriage records, and old parish registers. Marin watched her family's history unfold in fragments of ink and paper, names she recognized only vaguely from stories her grandmother used to tell. She saw Eleanor's birth record. She saw a marriage certificate between Eleanor Whitfield and a man named Arthur Combs, her grandfather, the man Marin had always known simply as her grandfather, the quiet woodworker who built her a dollhouse the year she turned 7. "There is no mention of Edmund Ashworth in any of these records," Julian said, frowning slightly. "Which makes sense, given the engagement was broken before any legal marriage occurred. It leaves us relying mostly on the letter and the photograph." "Is that not enough?" "Legally, it may be a longer process than I hoped, but it is not impossible." Marin closed the folder in front of her and rubbed her eyes. "I do not know if I even want the cottage anymore," she admitted. "I keep thinking about my grandmother, about what she must have carried all those years, and it makes the property feel less like a gift and more like an old wound someone is asking me to reopen." Julian was quiet for a moment. "I understand that more than you might expect. Sometimes inheritance is not only about money or land. Sometimes it is about carrying forward the weight someone else could not put down." Marin looked at him then, really looked, past the coat and the manner and the strange formality of his introduction days earlier. She saw someone tired in a way that had little to do with sleep, someone carrying an old family weight of his own, one he had not chosen and did not know how to set aside either. They left the archive as the sky began to darken, walking slowly along the street toward the town center. Neither of them suggested ending the day yet, and neither of them mentioned that fact aloud. "There is a garden near the old church," Julian said. "The archivist mentioned it earlier, said it had been maintained by volunteers for decades. Apparently there are records showing it was originally planted by a local family. He thought you might want to see it, given our conversation about the letter." Marin felt a small, unexpected thrill of curiosity. "Show me." The garden, when they arrived, was modest but beautifully kept, roses climbing along a low stone wall, lavender planted in neat rows near the entrance, exactly as the letter had described Eleanor's own garden decades earlier. A small plaque near the gate read, "Planted in memory of those who came before us," though it gave no specific names. Marin walked slowly among the roses, running her fingers lightly over the petals the way her grandmother used to. "It feels strange," she said, "like walking through a memory that is not entirely mine but close enough to ache." Julian stood a respectful distance away, watching her rather than the flowers. "I am sorry if bringing you here caused you any pain." "No," Marin said quickly. "It is not pain exactly. It is something closer to recognition, like finding a photograph of a place you have never visited but somehow already know. They stayed in the garden until the light faded almost completely, talking less and less as the evening wore on, comfortable in a silence that neither felt any urgent need to fill. When it finally grew too dark to see the flowers clearly, Julian offered to walk her home, and Maren, against every instinct that told her to be careful, allowed it. At her door they stood for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "Thank you," Maren said, "for today, for all of it." "Thank you for trusting me enough to spend the day with me," Julian said. "I know this whole situation began strangely, appearing at your door in the rain like some character from an old story." "It was strange," Maren agreed. "It still is." "Does that trouble you?" Maren considered the question honestly before answering. "It should, but it does not as much as I expected it to." Julian smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful, tired one from the inn. "I am glad to hear that." He said goodnight and walked back toward the high street, and Maren stood at her door for a long moment, watching him go, before finally stepping inside and locking the door behind her. She made herself tea she did not drink and sat at her small kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the day in fragments. The archive, the garden, the quiet way Julian had listened when she spoke about Peter, about Alice, about the shape her life had taken since the divorce. It had been a long time since anyone listened to her that carefully, longer still since she had allowed herself to notice being listened to. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Alice. "Mum, you have not called in a few days. Everything all right?" Maren typed back quickly. "All is well, darling, just busy at the shop. We'll call this weekend." She set the phone down and looked again at the letter and photograph, still resting on the table where she had left them that morning. She thought of her grandmother, young and laughing at a garden gate, carrying a secret that shaped the rest of her life without anyone ever knowing. Maren wondered, not for the first time that week, what kind of secret she herself might be carrying forward without realizing it yet. She went to bed early that night, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept returning to the garden, to the quiet stretch of silence beside Julian that had felt, against all reasonable expectation, comfortable rather than awkward. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that morning had arrived far too quickly, and that whatever she was feeling would fade once the paperwork was settled, and Julian returned to whatever life waited for him at Ravensmere. She almost believed it. Almost. The following 2 weeks passed in a rhythm Maren had not expected to fall into so easily. Julian extended his stay at the inn, citing the ongoing paperwork with Charles Whitmore as the reason, though both of them understood there was more to it than legal documents. He visited the shop most afternoons, sometimes helping with deliveries, sometimes simply sitting at the small wrapping table while Maren worked, talking about nothing important in the way that only matters between two people who are slowly becoming important to each other. Grace Bennet noticed first, as Maren had known she eventually would. "You have been smiling more," Grace said one morning, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee from the bakery next door. "I do not think I have seen you smile this much since before the divorce." "I do not know what you mean," Maren said, though she felt her face warm slightly. "The tall man who keeps visiting. The one everyone in town is calling the Duke, though half of them think it is some elaborate joke." "It is not a joke," Maren said. "There is a legal matter involving my grandmother. He is helping me sort through it." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced by the explanation, though she did not push further. "Well, legal matter or not, it suits you, whatever it is." Maren changed the subject quickly, but the conversation stayed with her throughout the day, a small nagging reminder that whatever was happening between her and Julian was becoming visible to others, whether she was ready for that or not. That afternoon, Julian arrived carrying a small wooden box he said had been found among his grandfather's old belongings during a recent search of the estate archives. Inside was a collection of pressed flowers, carefully preserved between sheets of thin paper, along with a small handwritten note that read simply, "From the garden, that summer." "I thought you might want to see these," Julian said, setting the box carefully on the table. "The archivist believes they may have been pressed by Alina herself, given the timing and the note." Marin lifted the lid gently, almost afraid to disturb the fragile petals inside. Lavender. A single rose, faded to a pale brown but still recognizable in shape. A small sprig of something she could not quite identify, delicate and thin as paper. "She kept a piece of it," Marin said quietly. "All those years tucked away somewhere, a piece of a life she never got to have." Julian did not respond immediately. He watched Marin's face carefully, the way her fingers hovered just above the flowers without quite touching them. "I do not know how to feel about any of this," Marin admitted. "Grateful, sad, angry somehow, though I am not sure at whom." "Perhaps all of it at once," Julian offered. "Grief rarely arrives in only one shape." Marin closed the box carefully and set it aside, focusing instead on the bucket of white roses she had been arranging before he arrived, needing something to occupy her hands. "Can I ask you something?" Julian said after a moment. "You may." "Your ring, the one your grandmother wore, mentioned briefly in the letter, do you still have it?" Marin's hand stilled over the roses. She had been dreading this question, or one like it, since the letter first mentioned a ring passed down through Alina's side of the family, a small item of sentimental rather than significant financial value, according to Edmund Ashworth's own words. "No," Marin said, "I do not have it anymore." "May I ask what happened to it?" Marin's fingers found the stem of a rose, and she trimmed it more forcefully than necessary, the motion sharp and unthinking. "Peter sold it," she said. "During the divorce. We needed money for the lawyers, and he said it was a waste, keeping an old ring that did not mean anything practical when we could turn it into something useful. I did not fight him on it. I was too tired to fight about anything by that point." The shop went quiet except for the small, precise sound of scissors against stems. "I am sorry," Julian said, his voice low. Marin did not respond right away. She kept working, kept trimming roses that did not need trimming, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the flowers rather than on him. "It was just a ring," she said finally, though her voice had gone strangely flat. "It was your grandmother's ring," Julian said gently. "It was not just anything." Marin set down the scissors and pressed both hands flat against the counter, steadying herself against something she could not entirely name. For a moment, the shop around her seemed to blur slightly at the edges, and she found herself thinking not of the ring exactly, but of the years leading up to its loss, the slow unraveling of a marriage she had once believed would last forever, the quiet humiliations that had piled up one after another, until selling a family ring had felt like nothing at all, one more small defeat among many. "I need a moment," Marin said quietly. Julian did not press her. He simply stepped back slightly, giving her space, watching without watching too closely, the way a person learns to do when they understand that comfort sometimes means simply staying present rather than offering words. Marin focused on the roses in front of her, counting them without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, 4, needing something concrete to hold her attention while the older feeling passed through and eventually receded. "I am fine," she said after a long moment, though her voice still carried a slight unsteadiness. "I do not know why that affected me the way it did." "You do not need to explain it," Julian said, "or justify it." Marin looked up at him then, surprised by the simplicity of his response. No questions demanding elaboration. No attempt to fix what could not easily be fixed. Just quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said. They did not speak further about the ring that day. Instead, Julian helped her finish preparing the roses for a wedding order due the following morning, his hands clumsy at first with the unfamiliar work, growing steadier as Marin guided him through the proper way to trim and arrange without damaging the delicate petals. "You are better at this than I expected," Marin said, some of her earlier tension easing into something closer to amusement. "I spent summers as a child helping the estate gardener," Julian said, "against my father's wishes, who believed a future duke should not be caught doing what he considered common labor. I did it anyway, whenever I could sneak away. Rebellious even then. In small ways, I never had the courage for anything larger." "Small rebellions add up," Marin said. "Sometimes they are the only kind that matter." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while longer, until the last of the roses were arranged and set carefully into the cooler for the night. Julian offered to help Marin close the shop, and she allowed it, appreciating the ordinary rhythm of shared, simple work after the heaviness of the earlier conversation. As they were locking the front door, Julian paused. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not for business, not about the letter or the cottage or any of it, simply dinner if you would allow it." Marin considered the offer longer than she needed to, though her answer had already formed itself somewhere beneath the hesitation. "Yes," she said finally, "I would like that." They agreed on the following evening, a small restaurant on the edge of town known more for its quiet corner tables than its ambitious menu, the kind of place where conversation mattered more than the food itself. Marin spent an unreasonable amount of time deciding what to wear, settling eventually on a simple green dress she had not worn since before the divorce, one Alice had once told her brought out the color of her eyes. The dinner passed easily, conversation moving between lighter subjects than they had touched on in recent weeks, town gossip, favorite books, the strange particular joy of finding a good cup of tea after a long day. Julian laughed more freely than Marin had yet seen him laugh, a genuine, unguarded sound that made something in her chest loosen slightly. Near the end of the meal, as they lingered over the last of their wine, Julian grew quieter, watching Marin with an expression she could not entirely read. "May I say something that might sound forward?" he said. "You may. I did not expect, when I knocked on your door those weeks ago, to feel anything beyond simple curiosity about an old family mystery. I certainly did not expect to find myself looking forward to seeing you every day since." Marin's chest tightened, not unpleasantly, but with the particular nervous weight of hearing something she had not allowed herself to hope for out loud. "I did not expect it either," she admitted. "I had made peace, or told myself I had, with the idea that this part of my life was finished, that I would run my shop, see my daughter when I could, and that would be enough." "Is it not enough?" Marin considered the question honestly. "It was enough before you knocked on my door. Now I am not entirely certain." Julian reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that the gesture carried its own weight. "I do not wish to complicate your life, Marin. If this is only complication, tell me now and I will respect it." Marin looked at his hand, close to hers on the table, and then at his face, searching, patient, waiting for whatever answer she was willing to give. "It is complication," she said slowly, "but I find strangely that I do not mind it." Something shifted in Julian's expression then, relief mixed with something warmer, something that made Marin's own breath catch slightly. "Then perhaps," he said, "we allow the complication to continue and see where it leads." "Perhaps," Marin agreed. They walked back through town slowly after dinner, neither in any particular hurry to end the evening. At her door, Julian did not attempt anything beyond a gentle press of his hand against hers, a small, deliberate gesture that said more than words might have. "Good night, Marin," he said. "Good night, Julian." She watched him walk away before stepping inside, her mind full of the evening, of the ring she had lost and the flowers her grandmother had pressed and kept, of the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken in the span of a few short weeks. She did not yet know that the following days would bring news from Ravensmere that would test everything they had begun to build, news that Julian himself did not yet fully understand the weight of, waiting for him back at the estate he had left behind to chase an old family mystery in a small town he had never expected to matter as much as it now did. For that one evening, at least, Maren allowed herself simply to feel content, walking through her quiet house, touching the letter and the photograph and the small box of pressed flowers one more time before finally going to bed, sleeping more soundly than she had in weeks. The call came on a Thursday morning, while Maren was arranging a delivery of sunflowers near the front window. Julian's voice on the phone sounded different than she had grown used to hearing it, tighter, more formal, the warmth from recent weeks replaced by something guarded. "I need to return to Ravensmere," he said. "There is a matter with the estate that requires my attention immediately." "What kind of matter?" There was a pause before he answered. "A financial one, mostly. There are debts my father left behind that were not fully disclosed until recently. My family's solicitors have been managing it quietly, but it has reached a point where I must be present to make decisions." "How long will you be gone?" "I am not certain, possibly a few weeks, possibly longer." Maren felt something tighten in her chest, though she kept her voice steady. "I understand. You should go where you are needed." "Maren," Julian said, his voice softening slightly, "there is something else I should tell you, something I did not expect to have to explain so soon." "Go on." "My mother has been pressuring me for some time to consider marriage, someone she considers suitable for the family name and its future. A woman named Beatrice Ellington, from a family with long-standing ties to Ravensmere. I have resisted the idea for years, but with the estate's finances in question, my mother believes a marriage to someone with Beatrice's family resources could help stabilize things considerably." Maren set down the sunflowers she had been holding, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Are you telling me you are considering it?" "No," Julian said firmly. "I am telling you because I do not want you to hear it from someone else, distorted into something worse than it is. I have no intention of marrying Beatrice Ellington or anyone my mother selects on my behalf, but I want to be honest with you about the pressure I am facing, because you deserve honesty, especially now." Maren closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the information. "Thank you for telling me directly." "I will call when I can," Julian said, "and I will return as soon as this matter allows." They ended the call shortly after, and Maren stood alone in her shop for a long moment, staring at the sunflowers without truly seeing them, her mind circling around the conversation, searching for reassurance she was not entirely certain she had been given. The following days passed slowly. Julian called occasionally, his voice often tired, distracted, clearly consumed by matters far beyond a simple flower shop in a small town. Their conversations grew shorter, and Maren found herself filling the silences with her own work, throwing herself into the shop's daily demands as a way of managing the uncertainty that had crept back into her life, just as she had begun to set it aside. Grace noticed the shift immediately. "You look tired again," she said one afternoon, setting down a cup of tea on the counter. "Different tired than before, though." "He had to return home," Maren said simply. "Family matters." "Do you think he is coming back?" Maren considered the question longer than she meant to. "I do not know." Grace studied her carefully. "For what it is worth, I have watched you these past weeks, and I have not seen you this alive in years, not since before things ended with Peter. Whatever happens with the Duke, do not let this experience convince you that you imagined all of it." Maren managed a small smile. "Thank you, Grace." News traveled quickly in a small town, and it did not take long before word reached Maren, through a customer who had read something online, that Julian had been seen at a formal event in London, alongside a young woman identified as Beatrice Ellington. daughter of a prominent business family with significant financial holdings. Marin read the brief article twice, her stomach tightening with each pass through the words. The photograph accompanying the article showed Julian in formal attire, standing beside a striking woman in an elegant dress, both smiling for the camera in the practiced way of people accustomed to public appearances. She set her phone down carefully and returned to her work, refusing to allow herself to spiral into assumptions she had no solid ground for. Still, doubt settled into her chest like a stone she could not quite dislodge. That evening, her daughter Alice called, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that momentarily lifted some of Marin's heaviness. "Mum, I saw something odd online," Alice said. "A photo of some duke at an event in London. The comments mentioned a small-town flower shop connected to him somehow. Please tell me this has nothing to do with you." Marin sighed. "It is a long story, darling." "I have time," Alice said. "Tell me everything." Marin found herself explaining the entire situation to her daughter, the knock on the door weeks earlier, the letter, the photograph, the growing closeness between herself and Julian, and finally, the recent silence following his return to Ravensmere. Alice listened without interrupting, and when Marin finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mum," she said finally, "I have not heard you talk about anyone like this since before you and Dad split. Whatever happens, I am glad you allowed yourself to feel something again." "I am not certain there is anything left to feel, given recent developments." "Do not decide that based on one photograph and internet gossip," Alice said firmly. "Talk to him directly. You deserve clarity, not speculation." Marin considered her daughter's advice carefully after they ended the call. She sat at her kitchen table with her phone in front of her, debating whether to call Julian directly and ask him plainly about the photograph, about Beatrice Ellington, about whatever pressures he now faced at Ravensmere. Before she could decide, her phone rang, Julian's name appearing on the screen. "I saw the article," Marin said, before he could speak first. Julian sighed heavily on the other end. "I was afraid you might. The event was a fundraiser my mother insisted I attend, primarily to reassure certain investors about the estate's stability. Beatrice was invited as well, at my mother's request, not mine. The photograph makes it appear far more significant than it actually was." "It is difficult not to feel uncertain, seeing something like that." "I understand," Julian said. "I should have called you before you saw it elsewhere. That was a mistake on my part." "What is happening there, Julian, truthfully?" There was a long pause before he answered. "The estate's debts are more significant than initially disclosed. My mother believes a strategic marriage is the fastest solution. I have told her repeatedly that I will not marry someone simply to solve a financial problem, but the pressure has not lessened." "And what do you want?" Another pause, longer this time. "I want to return to that small town, to that flower shop, to the life I glimpsed there in these past weeks. But I also carry responsibility toward the people who depend on Ravensmere, tenants and staff whose livelihoods are connected to the estate's stability. I cannot simply abandon that responsibility, however much I wish my life were simpler." Marin absorbed his words carefully, feeling the weight of his situation even as her own uncertainty lingered. "I do not know how to compete with an entire estate's financial future," she said quietly. "You are not meant to compete with anything," Julian said firmly. "This is not a competition, Marin. It is simply a complicated situation I am trying to navigate honestly, without losing what I have found with you." They spoke for a while longer, though the conversation carried a heaviness neither could fully shake. When they finally said goodnight, Marin sat alone in her kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at nothing in particular, turning his words over in her mind. The following 2 weeks brought only sporadic contact, brief calls interrupted by estate matters, occasional messages that felt increasingly strained under the weight of distance and uncertainty. Marin threw herself further into her work, taking on additional orders, staying later at the shop than necessary. Anything to avoid sitting too long with her own unanswered questions. Then, on a quiet Tuesday evening, as Marin was preparing to close the shop, the small bell above the door rang. Julian stood there, looking exhausted in a way she had not seen before, his coat wrinkled from travel, dark circles beneath his eyes. "I resigned my mother's proposed arrangement," he said, without preamble. "I told her plainly that I would find another solution to the estate's finances, one that did not involve marrying a stranger for convenience. It has not been well received, but it is done." Marin stood frozen for a moment, processing his sudden appearance, his words. "You came back," she said finally. "I could not stay away," Julian said. "Not from this town, not from you." Marin crossed the small distance between them, and for a long moment neither spoke, simply standing close enough to feel the relief radiating between them. "I do not know what comes next," Julian admitted quietly. "The estate's problems remain unresolved. I do not have easy answers yet." "Perhaps we do not need easy answers tonight," Marin said. "Perhaps it is enough that you are here." Julian reached out and gently took her hand, the same small, deliberate gesture from their dinner weeks earlier, though it carried far more weight now, given everything they had both weathered to arrive at this quiet moment. "I want to figure this out," Julian said. "Whatever it takes, I do not want to lose this." "Neither do I," Marin admitted. They stood together in the quiet shop, surrounded by the scent of roses and lavender, neither certain exactly what the coming weeks would bring, but both aware, in that shared silence, that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they intended to face them together rather than apart. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it often does in small towns, first as a few brave crocuses pushing through frost-hardened soil, then gradually as longer days and warmer afternoons that made Marin's shop smell constantly of fresh green stems and newly opened blossoms. Julian had remained in town through the worst of the estate's financial troubles, splitting his time between Ravensmere and the small inn on the high street, though most evenings found him at Marin's kitchen table rather than anywhere else. The solution to the estate's debts had come not through marriage, as his mother had once insisted, but through a combination of careful restructuring, the sale of a distant, unused property, and Julian's own decision to open parts of Ravensmere to public tour for the first time in generations, an idea his mother had initially resisted, but eventually accepted once the additional income proved steady and reliable. "She still does not entirely approve of you," Julian said one evening, as they walked together through the garden near the old church, the same garden that had first stirred something unexpected in Marin months earlier. "But she has stopped suggesting Beatrice Ellington as an alternative, which I consider meaningful progress." Marin laughed softly. "I suppose that counts as a victory of sorts." "A small one, but I will take what progress I can get where my mother is concerned." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the roses along the low stone wall in full bloom now, lavender scenting the air around them just as it had months earlier, when Marin first felt the strange, aching recognition of a memory that was not entirely her own. "I received the final paperwork from Charles Whitmore this week," Julian said. "The cottage is officially yours, fully, legally, without any remaining complications." Marin stopped walking, absorbing the news. "I still do not know what I will do with it." "You do not need to decide immediately." "I think," Marin said slowly, "I would like to see it properly before deciding anything." They drove out to the cottage the following weekend, a modest stone building set back from a quiet country road, surrounded by overgrown gardens that had clearly once been carefully tended, decades of neglect visible in the tangled hedges and cracked pathway leading to the front door. Marin stood at the gate for a long moment before entering, taking in the small house that had belonged to her family generations ago, The house where Alina had perhaps once imagined a different life entirely, before circumstance and family pressure had rerouted everything toward the quieter existence she eventually built instead. Inside, dust covered every surface, but the bones of the house remained solid: good stone walls, a working fireplace, windows that still let in generous afternoon light despite years of grime. Marin walked slowly through each room, imagining her grandmother young and hopeful, imagining the different paths a single broken engagement had closed off forever. In the garden behind the house, half buried beneath decades of overgrowth, Marin found the remains of what had clearly once been a carefully planned flower bed: roses gone wild and thorny, lavender that had somehow survived years of neglect, spreading determinedly across the untended soil. "It is still alive," Marin said softly, kneeling beside the stubborn lavender. "After all this time, it is still growing." Julian knelt beside her, examining the tangled garden with quiet interest. "It seems fitting, somehow. Whatever your grandmother planted here, it endured despite everything." Marin ran her fingers through the lavender, breathing in its familiar scent, feeling something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled since Julian first knocked on her door months earlier. "I would like to restore this garden," she said. "Not exactly as it was, but something new, built from what is left of what she started." "I could help if you would allow it," Julian offered. "I have some experience, however amateur, thanks to those childhood summers with the estate gardener." Marin smiled at him, the same warmth from their earlier conversations returning easily now. "I would like that very much." They spent the following weeks slowly clearing the overgrown garden together, weekends mostly, since Marin's shop demanded her attention during the week, and Julian's estate responsibilities remained significant despite the improved financial situation. They pulled weeds, trimmed the wild roses back to manageable shapes, and carefully transplanted the surviving lavender into a more organized arrangement, while also planting new additions: a few young rose bushes, a small patch of wildflowers Marin had always loved but never had proper space to grow at her own shop. Grace visited once, curious about the cottage everyone in town had begun discussing, and stood at the garden gate watching Marin and Julian work together with dirt-streaked hands and easy laughter passing between them. "You look happy," Grace observed, leaning against the gate. "Properly happy, not just relieved happy." "I think I am," Marin admitted, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "I did not expect to feel this settled, given how strangely everything began." "Sometimes the strangest beginnings lead to the steadiest endings," Grace said. "Or so I choose to believe anyway." As summer approached, the garden began to take proper shape, roses climbing the old fence in careful arrangement, lavender filling the air with its familiar scent each evening. As Marin and Julian sat together on a small bench they had restored from the cottage's original furnishings, watching the light fade slowly across the property that had waited decades to be properly cared for again. One particular evening, as the sun set behind the hills beyond the cottage, Julian reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped item, setting it gently in Marin's palm. Inside the wrapping was a ring, simple in design, clearly old, the kind of piece that carried history rather than flashy value. "This was among my grandfather's belongings as well," Julian explained quietly. "Charles Whitmore found it recently during a final review of the estate archives. There is a note with it, written in Edmund's hand, stating it was meant for a Alina, purchased before the engagement was broken, never given to her." Marin stared at the ring, turning it slowly in the fading light. "I am not offering this as any kind of proposal," Julian said quickly, perhaps noticing the slight widening of her eyes. "I only thought it belonged with you, given everything it represents. What you do with it, whether you wear it or simply keep it as a piece of your family's history, is entirely your choice." Marin held the ring carefully, feeling the weight of it, the decades of unspoken history it carried. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding that this needed to be my choice, not something decided for me." They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, the garden around them settling into evening quiet. The scent of lavender and roses mixing pleasantly in the cooling air. "I do not know what the future holds for us," Marin admitted eventually. "Titles, estates, small flower shops, none of it fits together in any obvious way." "Perhaps it does not need to fit together obviously," Julian said. "Perhaps it only needs to work for us in whatever shape that takes." Marin considered this, looking out over the garden that had waited so long for someone to return and tend it properly. "I would like to keep the shop," she said. "I am not ready to give that up, even if things between us continue to grow." "I would never ask you to give it up," Julian said firmly. "Whatever happens between us, your shop, your independence, that remains entirely yours. And Ravensmere, your responsibilities there. They remain mine as well. But perhaps there is room for both, if we are patient enough to build something that honors what each of us already has, rather than asking either of us to abandon it." Marin looked down at the ring in her palm, then back at Julian, watching the fading light play across his face, patient, honest, present in a way she had not expected to find again after so many years of believing that part of her life had quietly closed. She placed the ring not on her finger, but on a simple chain she wore around her neck, letting it rest close to her chest rather than committing to any decision she was not yet ready to make. "Not yet," she said softly, though her voice carried no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that felt entirely her own. "But perhaps someday." Julian smiled, understanding immediately, reaching for her hand as the evening settled fully around them. The garden her grandmother had once tended now blooming again after decades of neglect, carrying forward not just old sorrow, but something new and still growing, patient and unhurried, exactly the way the best things tend to grow. They sat together until the stars appeared fully overhead, neither speaking further, simply present in the quiet garden that had brought them together, content for now with the uncertainty of what came next, trusting that whatever it was, they would meet it together, one season at a time.